My name is Jim, and we're going to be looking at these different wire strippers today on
Kilimanjaro.
We've got 4 different wire strippers here of various different types. This one is kind of your traditional style. It's considered a manual wire stripper, and what that means is that you have to cut the insulation, then pull it off in 2 separate steps. These other ones here are kind of supposed to eliminate one of those steps, make it a little bit easier for you. They're kind of considered automatic wire strippers, and they do it all in one motion. You squeeze, it cuts and pulls the insulation off all at once. They work in a couple different ways though, so let's go through them. So this one is a Vise-Grip branded wire stripper. This style is made by a couple different companies. I assume it's off patent now, so a couple different companies have copied it. This one was about $30. And the way it works is it's got 2 jaws on the sides here. You stick the wire in like this. This side here, as you squeeze it down, these jaws kind of lower and clamp onto the wire. And then this side here will kind of cut the wire and then start to pull it open and strip the insulation off. It's got a little stop here so that you can get a consistent length of wire strip if you're trying to make a J-hook or something like that to go on an outlet. Problem with this one here though is the blades on the cutting side are just straight surfaces there. So although they won't go all the way through the wire, they don't wrap around the wire, they don't cut all the insulation, they just kind of nick it and then drag it off. So it doesn't work super well in practice. This one here is very similar. This is the Ideal Stripmaster. This one is made in the US, this one's made in Taiwan. And it's got dies on the one side, so you put the wire in whichever the appropriate size is. Then as you squeeze it, it will cut the insulation all around the wire, and then this other side will clamp onto it, and then when you pull it apart, the insulation should come off. This one here, the kind of traditional style, it has some dies similar to this. You pick whichever is the right size, you clamp it down, it cuts the insulation, and then you just yank it off. Super easy to do. These ones are made by Southwire. They're very high quality. They were about $20. This one here is about $50. And they're nice and sharp and they work well for cutting that insulation. Then last here we have this Knipex one. This one was about $55. It's made in Germany and it works in a kind of different way. You put it on the end of the wire and then it's got a V-shaped kind of cutter on it which comes down at the same time that there's a little tab at the front that clamps onto the wire, and then as you squeeze it pulls the insulation off and then opens up the clamp at the end to release the wire. It also has a little stop in here to let you get a consistent length of wire strip, which is very convenient, and it's got an adjustable setting here that adjusts how far it's going to try to cut that insulation and clamp down on it as you're going. And I found that is set pretty well from the factory. So each one of these has some couple different extra features on them. This one has a wire cutter at the top here. You can see it cuts down on the blade there. Kind of interesting about this one, it's made in Germany. It's obviously meant for an international market. It does say 10 to 24 wire gauge on it, but then it also gives it in 0.2 to 6 millimeters squared of wire diameter. I guess in Europe that's how they measure wire size. For the wire cutter, it only lists the 2.5 millimeters. I think that's square millimeters, which means it's a little bit smaller, or a little bit bigger than a 14 gauge wire. So it's not a 12 gauge wire, although I've used it with 12 gauge wire without a problem before, but that's not what that cutter is rated for. Now these guys here have lots of extra features on them. First off, they act as needle nose pliers. They've got some little grips at the front, which is great if you're trying to get into an electrical box or just grab a wire, stuff like that. Super handy to have that there. They also have a little spot here where you can stick a wire in and then bend it around to make your J-hook if you're going to attach that to an electrical outlet or something like that. And it's got one on each side, so no matter which way you're holding this, you've always got one kind of to be able to bend into just the right spot. It also has these 2 threaded holes here for cutting screws. It'll cut either a 632 or an 832 screw. Those are the kind of the common size for electrical outlets, electrical boxes, stuff like that. So you thread that in, cut the screw down, and then when you let go and unscrew it, that die that's in there will clean up the threads so that you have a nice end on that screw and it'll be able to thread in without a problem. These ones also lock, so they have a little tab here that locks and keeps them closed so that in your pocket they take up a little less room. I have found though that lock, frequently when you're cutting, it will kind of spring in and lock, and then it doesn't come apart. It's kind of a pain. But it would be easy enough to rip that off if you wanted. And then lastly, these have a wire cutter right in here. It's nice and big, and you can get around a wire. You can cut like a whole bundle of 12 gauge Romex all at once. It doesn't really work super well. If they were a little bit bigger, that would work a lot better but then of course, then the next size up, they wouldn't be able to cut. All right, I've got 4 different types of wire here. We're going to try each one of these wire strippers with these different types of wire, see which one works the best. So right here, I've got some 12 gauge Romex. This is kind of your typical house wire, at least in the US, used for all your different outlets and stuff in your house. Then we've got some speaker wire here. This is some 18 gauge speaker wire. It's actually copper coated aluminum wire, and it's stranded, so it's a little bit different there. We've got some electronics wire over here. This is a 20 gauge solid wire, and then this is a 22 gauge solid wire. This is actually beyond the capacity of the ones that have dies in them. They generally only go up to a 20 gauge or an 18 gauge wire, so we'll see how they make out with this though. So first off, let's start with this Knipex here. So for this one here, you just slide the wire in until it hits your stop there, and then you just squeeze it, takes the insulation right off, no problems. This one also has a wire cutter built in up there, so you can see, works like that. Just put the wire in, cuts it right off, no problem. Works really well. Then on the 18 gauge here, same thing. You just put the wire in. Sometimes it doesn't take the insulation all the way off, but it's easy enough just to pull it off with your fingers there. Then we've got the 20 gauge electronics wire. Put that in. Same thing, that it didn't take it all the way off, but it does get it the right length. It's not pushing that back, so that's nice. And then on the 22 gauge, put that in, cuts that off, no problem right there. Okay, next up we've got this Ideal Stripmaster here. Now this one has separate dies, so you gotta make sure you get the wire in the right size. So on this one here, this is a 12 gauge, so we'll put it right there. And you can see there was a little bit of a curve from when I bent it over there to cut the wire off, and it didn't do such a great job there. Some of this insulation got dragged back, it crimped it real hard, and it didn't take it off real cleanly. Now if this is cut nice and straight, like that, it's nice and straight, we put it in, then it comes off no problem, it works really well. The other time I've found that sometimes it'll work better to use the one size larger of a die. That works sometimes a little bit better, but then sometimes it won't take the insulation off, it won't cut it, and just kind of drags it around, so that's not great either. So on the 18 gauge speaker wire here, now you can see there's markings up here, and this has markings on the top for stranded and markings on the bottom for solid. Problem is I can never remember which one it is. The problem is that I don't always know what size wire gauge I'm working on. This spool here isn't labeled, so it can be a pain to make sure you get it in the right size die. Once you do, it works just fine. And one thing you may have saw is I stuck my finger in there when I let go, and that's because if you don't do that, if you're not careful when you pull it back, it'll spring back and squish your wire down. So as long as you're careful, you can stick your finger in there or just pull it out at the same time, then it works without a problem, but otherwise it can kind of mess up the end of your wire. So now we're going on to the 20 gauge, so that's all the way at the end here. That works great. And 22 gauge, now this is beyond the capabilities of this stripper, but we'll see if it cuts it anyway. And it does. You can see you can let it off, and sometimes it won't squish the wire when you're done. So next up, we'll try these Vise-Grip ones. So first on the Romex here, let me cut off this old piece. We stick it up to our little stop there, grab it, and it'll pull it off. Now sometimes what this does is it won't cut the insulation cleanly. Cut it. It'll actually just take it and drag it apart. So it'll push this back instead of taking off the insulation. And then you don't get the white size wire strip. It kind of squishes this insulation, and it doesn't work super well. Let's try it on this 18 gauge stranded here. Same thing, just put it in there. Comes off without a problem. On the 20 gauge, see, that time it didn't actually strip it. And that time it stripped it, but not like where I wanted it to. It stripped it a little bit farther back. And so I get this very large strip on here, which is not great. On this 22 gauge here, I cut off the old thing, put it in there. And once again, it kind of dragged it back instead of pulling it off, because those cutters came down and grabbed it here. So now when I take this off, I get a very long strip, which is not ideal there. This, you kind of adjust here how hard it's clamping down on here, but I found that if you don't have this clamped down all the way, it'll just drag on the insulation here instead. Okay, next we have the kind of manual Southwire ones. So you put those in there, cut that off real easy. Same thing that has the die. This is nicely labeled though, so you know that this side is solid. Put that in there, Squeeze it, give it a little turn, yank it off, no problem. I'll do that again here. I'm going to cut a little bit more off, squeeze it, turn it, pull it off. And then you can see these have a little spot here. You can stick that in like that, bend it around to make a nice hook to go around a screw terminal. You know, if you've got your outlet, you can now have this nice hook that goes right around there. That works really well. Then on this stranded wire here, cut off the old piece. So I got to look on the stranded side here, up to 18 gauge. That comes off real easily. On this 20 gauge solid, put that in there. Now this is actually beyond, this only goes up to 18 gauge, but we'll try it here and see how it works. It cuts it actually no problem. And the same thing with the 22 gauge, we're getting kind of pretty far behind this, beyond this. We'll try it anyway. It actually works pretty well. Now the one problem I have had with these is sometimes when I strip it, this lock pops in and locks it, and then you have to remember and undo it after every time, which is a bit of a pain. It's not the biggest deal, and I could probably take this off if it really starts to bother me. So sometimes you go in like this, and it pops in. So not my favorite, but it's not a big deal on those. Now these Southwires, like I mentioned, also will cut screws. So if we take a 832 screw here, we put it into the right size die, just screw that in there with my fingers. All right, and so now we can squeeze it down, cut that off, and unscrew it, and you got a nice surface on the end there. It's not as pretty as like the factory surface, but it's good enough that it'll thread in without an issue. So these four different here, I don't like these two ones. They were both fairly expensive and they don't work really well. This one here tends to tear the insulation rather than cut it. It doesn't have a way to really cut the insulation all the way around. It's just because it has two straight knives that go on either side of the round insulation. It's really just kind of scraping it and then tearing it, and it just doesn't work super well. You can kind of fiddle with the adjustment here about how tight you want, but I found it either makes it too tight and will grab too hard and just drag the insulation back, or it just doesn't do anything if it's too loose. So I'm not a big fan of these. This one here, I do like. It does seem to work pretty well. I don't like that when you let it go, though, it jams the wire together. And then, you know, on finer wire, on Romex, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be a big deal. But for kind of electronics wire, it smashes it together, particularly if it's stranded, and kind of makes a mess of it more times than I'd like. Also doesn't have the nice wire cutters on here or anything like that. Not the end of the world. You're usually going to be having another pair of those anyway. But just not really my favorite. I also don't like that you have to remember which size wire you're working with. It's fine if you're working all day with Romex, not the biggest deal. But if you've got a bunch of different electronic wires and stuff, it can be a pain to remember which size and then which die goes for which. The other problem with these is if you're in a tight spot like a box or something, you may not have enough room to get them around the wire and then open up all the way to get that wire stripped. So I'm not the biggest fan of these. These ones here are kind of the standard for a reason. They're reliable. They always work very well. The only thing I'll say about these is that they have to be sharp, right? They go around the insulation and they cut that insulation. And if they don't cut it, when you go to pull it, it's just going to yank it out, and that can be a real pain. So as long as these are fairly new and sharp, they work really well. I would say you got to get a high quality pair of these. If they're not high quality, they won't be sharp to start with. The blades won't match up real well, and it'll end up not cutting the insulation completely, and then when you go to pull it, it just drags over it or twists it or something like that. It doesn't work really well. I do really like these Southwire ones. They call it their patented double grip, but it's a nice comfy grip over the top of it. And these work really well, and they have a bunch of other stuff like the little needle nose that come in really handy. These ones are the newest ones I have, and I actually really like these as well. Now they were quite expensive. These were $55. It's also all plastic, which that price is a bit of a bummer, but it does mean that they're a lot lighter. So plastic is kind of a double-edged sword. It's a lot lighter. It's a lot cheaper for them to make, but it's theoretically not as durable as metal. Well, it's certainly not as durable, but for the same weight, it may be kind of about the same amount of durability. This is a really nice plastic. You can tell it's got a lot of glass fiber in there. There's no markings of what type of plastic it is in there, but it feels really stiff and feels, you know, really substantial, but it just doesn't have that weight to it. It's comfortable though, and the fact that they're lighter is pretty nice. These ones here particularly, they're quite heavy. If you got a full tool belt, full of stuff like this, it can add up. Having these be a little lighter is nicer. And I don't think there's any issue with these not lasting, right? There's no way you're going to abuse these to break them because they're made of plastic instead of metal, right? You're not twisting with this, nothing like that. So I think the fact that it's plastic is probably fine, but it just kind of feels for that price like they should be a little nicer. I think the part of the problem is that they're made in Germany, so they're much more expensive for the same material. The other thing is they're etched with the model number and the wire sizes on them. That's pretty hard to read, and once again, it just doesn't feel like a really nice tool. So I really like these. They work really well. I wish they weren't plastic, or at least I wish they weren't so expensive, but I do really like them. They're very convenient, particularly because they can go right into a box, grab and strip the wire, even if only a little bit of it is hanging out. They can reach in there and get it off without any problem. So my recommendation here would be either we get these Knipex ones. This style in particular, there's a more expensive style even that are closer to $100, and apparently they don't work really well, so I didn't get those. But this style in particular I found works really well. Otherwise, just get the old manual ones, get a nice high quality pair, and replace them often so that they stay sharp. And that's kind of true of all these, but particularly on these manual ones. Don't use them forever because eventually these are going to get dull. They're just not going to work so well. So if you have a pair of these and they aren't working well, first thing I would do would just get another pair, nice, good quality brand, and they should last you for a fairly long time, and then just replace them when they get dull. It's not really a good way to sharpen these. So if there's another type of wire strippers that you particularly like, leave them in a comment. Otherwise, thanks for watching.